Okay, so have you ever thought about how the cost of sugar, way back when could actually cause these huge national debates? I mean, there were times when people seriously wanted to put super high tariffs on sugar from other countries. And it wasn't even because we had tons of our own sugar, it was more about getting people to eat more honey. It's kind of wild, right?
Yeah, it shows how trade isn't just about, money and stuff. It
Yeah.
gets mixed up with all sorts of things like politics and even what people like to eat. And that actually leads us right into what we're diving deep into today. A listener, and thank you so much for this, sent in an idea to look into the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act from 1930. This thing just keeps coming up even after all these years.
Yeah, you're right. Like when you hear 1930s terrorists, it doesn't sound super exciting. But this one's kind of legendary. You're probably wondering why everyone's still talking about it and what it means for us today.
And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We've been looking at a bunch of different sources, articles, analysis, even some surprising pop culture references to figure out what the Smoot-Hawley tariff was all about. Our goal is to understand what caused it, what its impact was, and why it's still a big deal. This is basically your shortcut to understanding the core of Smoot-Hawley.
All right, let's get into the names behind this thing, Smoot and Hawley. They sound like characters from a history book, but they were real people who shaped this law. Who were they exactly?
So Reed Smoot was a Republican senator from Utah. The important part is he was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee from 1923 to 1933. That committee is where all the decisions about tariffs in the Senate happen.
So basically the Senate's main guy for tariffs.
Exactly. And then there's Willis Hawley, a Republican representative from Oregon. He was in charge of the House Ways and Means Committee from 1928 to 1931. Now, this committee is really important because in the U.S., any laws about taxes and tariffs, they usually start in the House of Representatives.
Uh,
So these are two powerful guys leading the charge on this law.
but, you'll often hear it called Hawley Smoot. But mostly people say Smoot-Hawley. Why is that?
Well, technically, since bills about money start in the House, Hawley's name should come first. But Senator Smoot, he was a really big supporter of the bill in the Senate. He was so involved that everyone just started calling it the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and it stuck. Probably didn't mind having his name on such a famous law.
Famous for sure. It's got quite a reputation, but why are we still talking about this law from almost 100 years ago?
Yeah, it might be old, but it's still relevant today. Richard Cooper, a Harvard economist, even said that President Hoover's decision to sign it was the most disastrous single mistake any U.S. president has made in international relations.
Most disastrous single mistake. That's pretty intense.
Yeah, it is. He basically argued that those big tariff increases and the fact that the U.S. seemed to ignore what it would do to other countries made the global economic situation even worse.
And then there's Sir Arthur Salter, this British civil servant, who said it was a turning point in world history. He believed it basically unleashed this wave of protectionism all over the world. Wow. So basically everyone agrees it was a massive blunder.
Well, not everyone. Some people say its bad effects have been blown way out of proportion. Alfred X, who used to be the chairman of the U.S. International Trade Commission, he says people have made up this whole legend around Smoot-Hawley. He thinks it was more of a small problem that's been overblown.
Interesting. Kind of like trying to rewrite history a little.
That's what he argues. And Pat Buchanan, he's more of a conservative commentator. He even says that none of the criticisms against Smoot-Hawley actually make sense. He claims it barely affected trade or the U.S. economy at the time. He says foreign trade wasn't that big a part of the American economy back then.
Wow. So from disaster to barely noticeable, that's quite a range of opinions.
It really is. And it even pops up in pop culture. Remember that movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Yeah, totally. Ben Stein, that monotone history teacher, going on and on about Hawley Smoot. Anyone. Classic.
Even though it's a funny scene, it shows that Smoot-Hawley is this well-known symbol of a really bad economic policy. So even if people disagree on how much economic damage it did, its cultural impact as a warning against protectionism is undeniable.
So the big questions for you, the listener, are what can we really learn from all this? And did this tariff actually cause the Great Depression all by itself? Those are the things we want to figure out today.
Exactly. So let's start by looking at what led to it. Now, you might think it was because the economy was doing badly, but the Smoot-Hawley tariff actually came about because of the 1928 election and this one group of people, American farmers.
Farmers. During the Roaring '20s, I thought that was a good time for the economy.
Yeah, it was for a lot of industries. But farmers in America were struggling all through the 1920s. During World War I, everyone wanted their crops, but after the war, demand went down and prices crashed. And while the rest of the economy bounced back, Farmers were in a slump for years, so Republican politicians wanted to win those farmers' votes in the 1928 election, so they promised to help them out.
And they thought tariffs were the answer. Seems kind of strange for farmers, especially if they're exporting crops.
You've hit on a key point here. They weren't revising tariffs because industries were being flooded with imports. It was more about Republicans trying to make farmers happy. But the problem is, tariffs don't really work for farmers who sell most of their stuff overseas. Things like cotton tobacco grains. The prices for those are set by the global market, so a U.S. tariff on the small amount that was imported wouldn't really change prices much.
Makes sense. If you're selling your corn on the world market, a tariff on imported corn into the U.S. isn't going to change what buyers in other countries will pay.
Exactly. Now, there were some smaller agricultural imports, things like certain vegetables, soybeans, wool, sugar, where tariffs could maybe shift some production to the U.S. or protect American producers.
Mm.
There were even arguments for tariffs on things like bananas fruits that we don't grow here to encourage people to buy American fruits like apples instead.
So, like a way to boost demand for local stuff indirectly.
Yep. But the big export-focused farmers, they weren't going to see much benefit. They'd actually tried to get help in other ways before, like with the McNary-Haugen bill.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. Didn't President Coolidge veto that bill a few times?
He did. Coolidge wasn't a fan of the government messing with prices. He thought it would mess up the market and be a pain to manage. But the pressure to help farmers was strong. So in 1928, the Republicans promised to put agriculture on an equal footing with other industries, meaning tariffs would probably change for more than just farm products.
So that promise to help farmers basically opened the door for other industries to want tariff protection too.
That's a big part of this story. To understand it, you got to look at what the political climate was like back then. There were big differences between regions in terms of how they felt about tariffs. The industrialized North, they were usually for high tariffs to protect their industries from competition abroad. The South, though, they relied on exporting cotton and tobacco, so they were usually against tariffs. And the Midwest was a mixed bag.
Yeah, they were buying manufactured goods, but also producing some agricultural stuff that had to compete with imports.
Right. And each member of Congress often cared more about what their own constituents wanted than about sticking to their party line. So you might have a Democrat representing a steel-producing district in Pennsylvania supporting tariffs on steel, even though the Democrats generally wanted lower tariffs.
So local economics could sometimes be more important than national party politics.
Exactly. And as a whole, Congress usually leans towards higher tariffs. You see, the benefits of a tariff are usually concentrated among a small number of domestic producers who really want them. The costs, though, are spread out among a ton of consumers, and the impact on each person is smaller, so it's harder to fight back.
Yeah, that makes sense. A steel company in Pennsylvania gets a direct benefit from a steel tariff, but everyone else just sees slightly higher prices for stuff made with steel. It's not enough to get them to do anything about it.
Exactly. And the way production and exports were spread out across the U.S. made this bias even stronger. Imports were coming from all over, so producers in every state could say they needed protection from foreign competition. Exports, though, were mostly from a few specific areas, so there was more political support for protectionism than for free trade. Plus, tariffs in the U.S. often changed in cycles, usually around elections or when the economy was doing poorly.
Okay, so we've got the background struggle farmers, a Republican promise, regional differences, and Congress generally liking protectionism. How did all of this turn into the Smoot-Hawley tariff?
Well, in April 1929, President Hoover called a special session of Congress specifically to talk about tariffs. He'd just taken office. His initial idea was pretty limited, mainly focused on helping farmers and making a few adjustments to other tariffs where it was needed. He even said he didn't want unwise protection that would hurt exports more than it helped imports.
Sounds like he might have had a hunch about what was coming.
You could say that. But what happened next was this incredibly detailed and honestly kind of overwhelming process within the House Ways and Means Committee. They went through the entire tariff code line by line, talking about rates for everything you could imagine, from bottle caps to antimony. It was mostly done behind closed doors, which meant lobbyists with connections had a lot of power. Even the subcommittees were often led by people who had ties to specific industries.
So the person from a district with lots of textile mills gets to chair the textile tariff subcommittee. Doesn't sound very impartial.
Not really. And there was a lot of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours going on. Like, you support my tariff on bottle caps and I'll support yours on antimony.
Mm-hmm.
It's not clear how much President Hoover's original idea of a more limited tariff actually influenced the final bill that came out of the House. Traditionally, Congress really liked to control anything to do with taxes and tariffs.
What about the Democrats? Did they just sit back and watch all this happen?
Not really. The Democrats were the minority party, and they were mostly against it. Some of the Northern Democrats were starting to like protectionism more, but most House Democrats were from the South, where people hated tariffs. Representative Cordell Hull, who later became Roosevelt's Secretary of State and a big supporter of free trade, wrote this really critical minority report. He said the whole process was controlled by lobbyists, and he even predicted they'd use log rolling to make tariffs even higher.
Sounds like he knew exactly what was going to happen.
He did. Hull said these tariffs would hurt most American farmers who depended on selling their stuff overseas by raising their costs and making it harder to sell abroad. Even President Hoover privately said he was worried that the House bill had way too many tariffs on industrial goods compared to farm goods. He asked House Republicans to fix it, but the group who really wanted protectionism, they didn't listen much. The one thing Hoover did insist on, though, was keeping the flexible tariff power. This let the president adjust tariff rates if the Tariff Commission recommended it.
So that flexible tariff was basically a way to make changes after the bill passed to fix mistakes or react to changes in the economy.
That was the idea. It had been around since the 4D McCumber tariff of 1922, and the progressives liked it because they hoped it would make tariff decisions less political. But even though Hoover had his doubts, the Republicans in the House passed the bill in May 1929, mostly along party lines. Interestingly, more Northern Democrats voted for it than Midwestern Republicans voted against it. Shows that regional economics were a big factor.
So the bill went to the Senate, and that's where Reed Smoot comes in.
Exactly. Smoot led the Senate Finance Committee, and he knew everything about tariffs. He saw this as his chance to get his name on a major tariff law. He even started calling it the Smoot-Hawley Act himself, putting his name first.
Maybe a bit of ego there.
Possibly. He definitely made it a partisan issue. He said if the Republicans didn't get their way on tariffs, everyone would know who to blame. Senator Ferdinand Simmons, a Democrat from North Carolina, led the opposition in the Senate. He called the bill indefensible and said it broke the promise to help farmers. He said it would actually cost farmers more than it would help them.
So the Senate became the main battleground.
Yeah, it did. And for a while, in October and November 1929, a group of Democrats and progressive Republicans, the insurgents, had a lot of power. They managed to lower tariffs on some things that farmers used a lot, like coal, lumber, leather, and footwear. They brought those tariffs back down to what they were in 1922, all in the name of tariff equality.
That must have been a blow to the people who wanted those really high tariffs.
It was. Some people even thought that the stock market was nervous about the possibility of this high tariff bill passing and that it contributed to the crash of 1929. But there isn't really strong evidence that connects the tariff debate to the crash directly. The stock market was going crazy, mostly because of public utilities, a sector that tariffs didn't really affect. Other things like investment trusts people buying stocks with borrowed money and the Federal Reserve making it harder to borrow money, those probably had a bigger impact.
So the tariff debates probably didn't cause Black Tuesday.
Most economists agree that it wasn't the main cause. Even stocks in industries that exported a lot or had to compete with imports, they followed the same trends as the rest of the market. But eventually, the Republican leaders in the Senate got things back under control using some classic political tricks. There's even this crazy story about Senator Smoot trying to add a ban on smut, basically obscene materials, to the tariff bill.
Hey, it's Smoot, Smite, Smut. Seriously.
No joke. Ogden Nash even wrote a poem about it. It shows how they were adding all sorts of random stuff to the bill as it moved through the Senate. At the same time, a group of economists published this report slamming the proposed tariff. They said it would hurt different parts of the economy and other countries would retaliate. Smoot basically called them idiots and said they didn't understand how things really worked.
Academics and politicians always getting along so well.
Right. The Senate debate went on forever, hundreds of hours and thousands of pages in the congressional record. Finally, in March 1930, the Senate passed its version of the bill. It included this thing called an export debenture, which was basically a subsidy for farm exports. It also limited the president's power to adjust tariffs. So some of those insurgent senators who didn't like high tariffs on industrial goods, they ended up voting for it. But when you look at the numbers, it seems like party loyalty was still the most important factor in the Senate vote, although economic interests probably played a role in setting the specific tariff rates.
So a mix of party politics and local economic interests deciding the outcome.
Exactly. The interesting thing is, even though the average tariff on farm products did go up other sectors like earthenware and glassware, they also saw big increases in their tariffs. So people argued that manufacturers were benefiting just as much, if not more, from a bill that was supposed to be for farmers. The House and Senate versions then went to a conference committee where they had to figure out their differences, especially about that export debenture and the flexible tariff thing.
Hmm.
The Senate really wanted to keep those things, which meant the whole bill could have failed.
So it was a standstill.
Yeah. But in the end, Smoot convinced the Senate to give up on those key points. They had to do that to make sure the bill passed. But it made some of the insurgent senators mad. Senator Caraway really criticized the final bill, saying it actually helped manufacturers more than the farmers it was supposed to help. And even more economists spoke out, saying exports would suffer and other countries would definitely retaliate. Despite all that, on June 17, 1930, President Hoover signed the bill into law. The stock market dropped after the news.
So after all that back and forth, what really happened to the economy because of Smoot-Hawley?
Well, it's important to look at it in context. It became a symbol of protectionism. But it wasn't that different from other trade policies Republicans had made before. And the actual increase in tariffs wasn't the biggest in U.S. history. It was less than the 14 tariff back in 1922.
So it wasn't like a complete break from the past.
Not really. But you have to remember that in the early 1930s, prices were dropping like crazy deflation. And a lot of the tariffs in Smoot-Hawley were specific duties, a fixed dollar amount for each imported item. When import prices fell because of deflation, the effective tariff rate, the percentage of the item's value that went to the tariff went way up, even if the law didn't change. Think about it. A $5 tariff on a $20 shirt, that's a 25% tariff. But if the shirt price drops to $10 because of deflation and the tariff stays at $5, the effective tariff rate doubles to 50%.
So deflation really magnified the effect of those tariffs.
Exactly. It's estimated that the Smoot-Hawley law itself increased the average tariff on things that had tariffs by about 15 to 18%, or about 6 percentage points. But when you add in deflation, the average tariff rate on those goods went from about 40% in 1929 to almost 60% by 1932. That's a total increase of about 47%.
Okay.
So roughly a third of that increase was because of the law itself, and two-thirds was because prices fell so much.
Okay, so tariffs went up, maybe not as much as some people say, but they did increase. Did that cause imports to plummet?
Imports did go down, but not by a huge amount compared to the total drop in global trade during the Great Depression. Some estimates from back then say U.S. imports were about $190 million lower than they would have been without the tariff. That's a reduction of roughly 6% overall.
So a noticeable drop, but not the only reason for the huge decline in international trade.
Most economists today agree with that. And this brings us to the big question, did Smoot-Hawley cause the Great Depression? The short answer is no, it wasn't the only cause. The Depression had already started before the tariff was fully in place, and it involved a bunch of things, like a big drop in investment banks failing all over the place and other factors.
So it wasn't the main thing that kicked off the economic disaster?
Probably not. Now economists have different ideas about how tariffs affect the economy. Keynesian economics says that tariffs can shift spending from imported goods to goods made in the U.S., which could boost local industries and output. Some economic models even show that Smoot-Hawley might have actually helped U.S. output a little if you don't think about how other countries would react. But once you factor in retaliation from other countries, the picture changes completely.
How about the monetarist view of economics? How does that fit in?
Monetarists focus on how much money is circulating in the economy. They say that under the gold standard, tariffs could affect how gold flowed between countries, which could then impact the domestic money supply. The U.S. actually had more gold coming in during the early 1930s, but then it started flowing out later. But the major bank failures that happened in the early 1930s don't seem to be directly related to the drop in exports caused by Smoot-Hawley. And from the real business cycle point of view, since foreign trade wasn't a huge part of the U.S. economy back then, the overall effects of the tariff were probably pretty small.
So it sounds like the tariff might have had some negative effects, but it wasn't the only reason for the Great Depression.
That's a key point. But one thing that Smoot-Hawley definitely did was trigger retaliation from other countries.
Like that economic warfare some people had predicted.
Exactly. Even while the bill was still being debated, a bunch of foreign governments and industry groups were protesting. They thought it was a step towards protectionism and warned they might take action. The Republicans in Congress mostly ignored them. They said it was a U.S. issue. They even put together a whole collection of these foreign protests, but it didn't change their minds. Democrats, though, they often said this was a big reason to oppose the bill. They knew other countries would retaliate.
They could see a trade war brewing.
They could. The funny thing is, some of the old-school Republicans who were against giving subsidies to farmers, they didn't seem worried about other countries raising tariffs on U.S. exports. Senator Thomas even called it a declaration of economic warfare. And the timing of Smoot-Hawley was really bad, because a lot of European countries were already in a recession, and they were trying to make a deal to not raise tariffs. Historian Charles Kindleberger said that Smoot-Hawley showed that America didn't care about the rest of the world, and it made everyone rush to put up trade barriers.
So other countries didn't just sit there and take it.
Nope. Canada was one of the first and biggest to retaliate, and it looks like it did hurt U.S. exports. Other countries like France, Italy, Spain, and the UK, they also retaliated, raising tariffs on American goods. And if you look at the data for global imports and U.S. imports, you can see they both went down after Smoot-Hawley. It's hard to say exactly how much of that was because of the tariff and how much was because of the Depression, but it definitely made the situation worse for global trade.
So even if people still argue about the impact on the U.S. economy, the effects on other countries seem pretty clear.
Yeah, the reaction from other countries was huge and probably made the Depression worse by making it harder for countries to trade.
So what happened right after it passed? Did Smoot and Hawley think it was a success?
Well, opinions were mixed right from the start. The Secretary of Commerce, Robert Lamont, he said publicly that he didn't see how the new tariff can be classed as a controlling factor in our present depression, and that it was passed at a bad time. Smoot, of course, disagreed. He said it was helping American industries and that other countries weren't really retaliating in any big way. He even said some tariffs weren't high enough.
Sounds like he was sticking to his guns.
For sure. A Harvard economist named Sumner Slichter, he called it an act of almost incredible economic folly. He thought it made the Depression way worse. Smoot, though, he still believed they needed it to protect against other countries dumping their products on the U.S. In the early 1930s, some Democrats and progressive Republicans tried to get rid of the tariff, or at least change it, but President Hoover vetoed it. He still thought it was necessary. But even some people who originally supported the tariff, like Senator Capper, they started having doubts as the world economy got worse and worse.
The debate just kept going, even though things were getting worse.
Yeah, it did. And in some ways, it's still going on today. More recently, some people, like Senators Hines and Hollings, they've been trying to debunk what they call the myth of Smoot-Hawley. They say its effects have been exaggerated and that it's not fair to blame it for the Great Depression. They point out that the Depression was already happening before the tariff was in full effect, and the imports coming into the U.S. without tariffs, they also went down a lot during that time.
So they're basically going against the common belief about Smoot-Hawley.
Exactly. And you still hear people mention Smoot-Hawley in arguments about trade deals today. It's often used as a warning about the dangers of protectionism. Think about the debates about NAFTA or trade with China. People who opposed those agreements were sometimes accused of wanting to go back to protectionism, like Smoot-Hawley. The Consumer Electronics Association even made ads that mentioned it.
So Smoot and Hawley have become these symbols in the history of global trade, representing everything that's wrong with protectionism.
Yeah, they're basically the bogeymen of protectionist trade policy. And like Richard Cooper said, we learned some important lessons from Smoot-Hawley about how countries will fight back with tariffs and how economic depressions and political problems are all connected. He even said that it might have contributed to the conditions that led to World War II.
That's a pretty big legacy.
It is. And we have to remember what things were like back then. The gold standard and the idea that government should always have a balanced budget, those limited what policymakers could do during the Depression. So maybe that's why they ended up relying more on trade restrictions. Today, we have floating exchange rates and more tools to manage the economy, so it's less likely that protectionism would actually help. In the end, the economists who were against the tariff, they said it would hurt exports and other countries would retaliate, and it seems like they were right.
Okay, so to sum things up, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, it was a complicated law that came about because of political promises. It was supposed to help farmers, but then it became about protecting all sorts of industries. People still argue about how much it affected the Great Depression, but we know for sure that other countries retaliated, and that made it harder for everyone to trade. It's not as simple as saying protectionism caused the Depression.
It really isn't.
Hmm.
And that leads us to something for you to think about. We've talked about all the political stuff, the economic factors, the global consequences. What do you think are the lasting lessons about trade policy in today's world that we can take from Smoot-Hawley? And do you think it's a good comparison to use in debates about trade deals today, given how complicated it was and what actually happened? It's something to consider.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a really fascinating and still important part of history.